In this project, we'll practice various methods of reserving whites and lights in watercolor as we paint 3 daisies in a jar in front of a sunny window. This project assumes you already know how to mix and apply watercolor of a desired color and strength, lay flat and graduated washes, and suggest foliage by sponging or stamping or a similar method. If you need help with any of these skills, you may wish to watch earlier projects or lessons in the Watercolor Jumpstart series on my website at www.dragonflyspiritstudio.com. Follow the links to classes and workshops, and then Watercolor Jumpstart. In this project, you'll begin to learn how to determine the painting sequence and strategy, and also will practice several methods for reserving whites or lights by creating blooms, lifting, using a resist, or negative painting. In a single project, we'll use only a few of the many methods for reserving whites and lights. For more information about this topic, watch the project lessons parts 1 through 4, which cover these techniques in much more detail. For this project, you'll need an 8-inch by 11-inch sheet of watercolor paper. To tear a sheet this size, take a quarter sheet of watercolor paper and fold it as shown in this diagram so that there is a 1-inch extension on one side. This will leave you with an 8 by 11-inch sheet and a 7 by 11-inch sheet. Download the project template from the Watercolor Jumpstart class page and transfer it onto your 8 by 11 sheet of watercolor paper by your favorite method. I've made my lines very dark so that you can see what I'm doing on the video, but you probably don't want to see dark lines around your flowers in the finished product, so you should make your pencil lines just dark enough that you can see them. If you find that your lines are too dark after you've transferred your drawing, use a kneaded eraser to pull off as much of the graphite as you can before you get the paper wet. It's much harder to erase pencil lines after they've been wet. You may also wish to download the project reference photograph to give you more information as you're painting. Finally, there's a labeled version of the project template that indicates which techniques we'll be using to reserve whites and lights, if you wish to have it for reference as we work. Begin by applying masking fluid to the lower flower on the left side and to the highlights along the sides of the jar. Then apply gum arabic to the small highlights in the center on the upper portion of the jar. Once the resists have dried, your piece will look something like this. I'm making a nice large puddle of a strong neutral gray for the background. Sometimes when you have to make a large amount of a color, it's easier to squeeze a little bit of fresh color out on your palette so you don't have to work so hard redissolving the dried color that's already in your palette wells. You may have heard that watercolors are painted light to dark, but that doesn't mean that you have to paint all the light areas of the painting before you paint any dark areas. It simply means that in any given area, you can paint the lighter colors first and then layer darker colors on top later. So in this corner, we can paint the light gray first and then come back later and add the darker gray portion of the wall and the darker gray portion of the shadows. I've mixed a nice light gray, and I'm going to begin on this side with the window ledge and continue right on down the wall, even though that area will be darker later. Notice that as I reached the tabletop, I continued my wash right over the line. This is easier than attempting to paint up to a line with one color and then paint another color right next to it. Typically, you'll have either a little white line or a double layer and a funny looking darker line at the join. Instead, it's better to continue your wash right on through that join between things and allow the later washes to define the differences between the different areas. You'll see how this works as we layer later our shadow areas and our darker portion of the wall. To avoid a hard edge here where the stem goes up into the jar, I'm simply going to soften that area with water and allow that gray to bleed up into the jar. I can blot it a little bit too with a towel so that the distinction isn't very clear and it will look more natural in the end. Now we need to let that area dry, so let's go work on our other area of the wall. In this area, we'll paint around the flower, but we can paint our gray right underneath these stems and leaves because they're a darker color. At this point, it will be easier for me if I turn the board around and continue my wash going the other direction. Don't be afraid to change a brush into the other hand if it makes it easier for you to get into a little area where you need to go around a small shape. There's a little section of the wall visible over here on the right side of the flower as well, so I'll come over here and paint that, once again painting around the flower shape. Notice that it's not terribly difficult to paint around this flower, so there was no need to mask that particular flower. At this point, I'll begin to join my wash with the other portion of the wash that's waiting for me. And now I'm going across the area where the lower flower is masked. This is because as we move down this wall, we want to allow our wash to become lighter, and painting a graduated wash and keeping it connected on either side of the flower might be rather difficult. Because I've masked the flower on the lower left, I only need to paint around the flower on the right, and then I can go right across the mask and begin diluting my wash to get the graduated wash I need over on the left side of the painting. This area of the jar is actually gray as well, although a paler gray. So I'm going to continue my wash with this diluted color right across the jar as well, allowing the gum arabic and the masking fluid to reserve my little highlights along the edge. We might even have been able to paint this entire area, including the light gray that we did at first, all in one wash, but I wanted the jar slightly lighter, so I thought this method might work well. There's not one single way to do this. For this light highlight at the bottom of the jar, while the wash is still wet, I'm going to use a paper towel to blot out a lighter area so that it'll have a soft edge and be sort of subtle. You may have to blot several times because the paper's still damp, so the surrounding wash will want to try to keep moving back into that area. Now, while things are again still wet, I'm going to put in some of the darker shapes so that they'll blend softly and give the sense of diffuse light coming through the jar. These shapes are stems, but notice because of the shapes in the jar itself, there's some distortion. It works better to just allow the color to move and let the viewer's eye and brain suggest what the objects are instead of trying to define them too clearly. Over on this side, there are simply some squiggly shapes. We don't really know what they are, suggesting possibly a leaf in the background or a little bit of refraction in the glass. There is a little bit of a light area along the side of the window that I didn't paint when I was painting my darker wash. We could have painted the entire area light gray and then come back with a darker wash, but this is such a small shape, it really didn't seem necessary. As I said before, there are many different ways to sequence a painting. You'll begin to learn over time which ones you prefer in which situations. For now we need to let this first layer dry before we proceed, so it's time for a cup of tea. Now that the first layer is dry, we can add the darker areas on the lower side of the window and the shadow of the jar. Using my dark neutral gray, I'll paint this small square. And although you can't see it in the photo, I think I'd like to drop in some even darker gray right along the bottom and the outside edge so that we'll get a sense of light spilling in the window towards the jar. And I'll just allow that color to blend softly into the previous wash. Now we'll do the shadow area underneath the jar. Notice that, as you see in the photograph, it's not exactly clear where the base of the jar is, and so I allow my shadow to follow this shape up into the jar here and there, just as it does in the photograph. Look how a sense of light comes out now that we're adding that dark shadow below our light highlight in the jar. As I did before, I'm going to soften and blend this edge, where the stem appears to simply merge into the shadow below. This is called lost edges, and it's a very effective way to make things appear to be part of the same scene instead of pasted on cutouts. Notice that you can see some of the darker areas of the wall through the jar, and we haven't depicted that yet. So now I'm going to come back with a lighter gray and create the sense of those soft-edged, darker shapes within the jar. I'm going to begin by wetting the entire jar so that as I drop in color, the edges of the shapes will be soft and diffuse the way they are in the photograph. My rinse water has quite a bit of color in it, so I think I'll just re-blot that highlight at the base of the jar so that I don't lose it. Now we can drop the darker color into the already wet jar and allow the edges to blend softly with the areas around them. Remember that when you're dropping color into an area that's already wet, you may need to make it a bit darker than you intend to have in the final product so that as it blends with the water on the paper, it doesn't become too dilute. I'm not doing anything in particular here. I'm just sort of letting my brush dance around and create shapes without worrying about making them into things. The viewer's eye will do the work of interpreting what these things might be. Now, while the interior of the jar is drying, let's go over on the right-hand side and do some of the leaves in the background. I'm going to do these just with simple brushwork. I mix up a few different greens, sort of an olive green and a bit darker green, so that I can vary my colors as I load each time I load my brush. And then I simply allow my brush to help me make leaf shapes. I don't worry too much about staying exactly inside the lines because after all, those planting marks were simply to remind me to put a leaf there. The leaf doesn't have to have exactly the same shape as the planting marks that I've made. So if I'm a little bit over the line or inside the line, that's just fine. Here and there, while the paint is still wet, I'll drop in a little bit of darker colors to suggest shadowing. And then we will come back and put the more defined shadows in a bit later after things are dried. For the three little spiky leaves going off to the right, I think a rigger might be a great tool. Just a little flick of the brush is a great way to suggest those leaves. I love that dry brush, and I hope that happens when I try it on the actual painting. Oops, I didn't follow my pencil line. But remember, your pencil line should be much lighter than mine. It doesn't matter exactly where these three little spiky leaves go, so rather than let it be overworked, simply accept whatever happens there and move on. Now we'll continue with the leaves on the upper portion of the window. Wherever possible, I'm going to use the shapes that my brush makes naturally to suggest these leaves. Only in a few places will I have to resort to coloring in an area that I've defined so that I can work around my flower shapes. Now I'm adding my shadow shapes on the leaves with a darker green. These leaves are still slightly damp, so those shadow shapes will be soft edged because I don't want them to draw the viewer's attention too much. Now with the darker green, we'll continue painting these leaves that are in front of the back wall, right on top of our previous wash. In the video, there appears to be very little difference in color, but in real life, it's actually more visible. Even if yours appears not to be very visible at all, I encourage you to simply go ahead and paint your leaf shapes without worrying about it. As you'll notice in the photo, in this area it's really rather difficult to see the difference between the leaves and the wall in any case, so just a subtle suggestion is all that's really needed. As you reach this lower section, the leaves become more distinct from the background, and our eyes are amazingly adept at connecting these areas of similar color into objects and interpreting them. So don't feel as though your brush has to do all the work for the viewer. Remember that it's perfectly okay to turn the page around if it makes it easier for you to get your brush into a particular area, such as these leaves that extend over on the left side of the painting. I've let everything dry thoroughly, and now that I've painted every area that involved the masks or the resists, I'm going to remove the masking fluid and gum arabic and reveal the highlights in the jar and the flower on the left side. To remove masking fluid, I'm using a rubber cement pickup. This looks like an eraser, but it's actually a block of crepe rubber that sticks to the rubber of the masking fluid and allows it to lift off the page. It's hard to see in the video, but I'm pressing and lifting as much as I'm scrubbing. If you press hard as though you were erasing, you may actually move adjacent color. So try to use more of a lifting motion to pull the masking fluid off instead of an erasing motion. Now I'll remove the little lights along the side. You'll notice that as you're removing masking fluid, it eventually accumulates on the rubber cement pickup, and you need to pull those little blobs off and throw them away. Now we'll remove the gum arabic. Recall that gum arabic is removed by dissolving it, so I'll add some water on top of the areas that have the gum arabic, and then blot with a paper towel to lift the loosened gum arabic off the paper. Remember, if you need more help with any of these methods of using resists, you can go back and watch the lesson video on using resists for much more information. There was a larger highlight on the right side of the jar that I forgot to mask with gum arabic. This is not a disaster, as I can use the method of lifting dry paint that you learned in the second lesson video. I'm going to use my angle shader and apply plenty of water and tap up and down and blot until I've removed some of the paint in that area. I probably won't be able to make as bright a highlight as if I had remembered to mask this with the gum arabic, but it doesn't really matter. I'm not trying to make a photo enlargement. I'm trying to create the illusion of a jar with light streaming through it. No one really knows exactly where those highlights were. I'm also going to lift a few soft highlights in the background leaves on the upper left side of the painting. There are other ways to do this, but I've found that this is often the best way to create a subtle highlight in the background that doesn't call too much attention to itself. Notice how these little lifted highlights give a good sense of variation in the light without calling too much attention to themselves. The leaves on the right side have dried enough now that I can add these small dark shadows in a second layer. This is what we mean by painting light to dark. For the suggestion of seedy or ferny little bits of foliage in the background, I think I'm going to use the method of stamping with saran wrap or banding film. For a bit more control, I'll use my brush to transfer the paint mixture onto the banding film. These droplets are sort of large, but I can crinkle the paper and break them up until they look like the type of ferny foliage that I want to suggest. Now I simply place the banding film where I'd like to create the suggestion of foliage and use my finger to press the paint onto the page. On the left side, I'd like to lift a little suggestion of this ferny foliage, so I'm going to spritz small droplets with my Holbein spray bottle and allow them to sit for a moment to soften the gum arabic. Then I'll take a paper towel and press firmly to lift just in those spots where the droplets fell. And I'll do just a little bit more here on the upper portion of the left side. Remember, you have to wait a moment for the gum arabic to soften in order to lift paint by this method. Next, I'll use my damp angle shader to lift that soft highlight on the front of the jar in the same method that we used for the Marbles in the Sun project. I'm getting my angle shader just barely damp because I don't want to move too much paint. To suggest form in the flowers, I'm going to paint the shadow shapes roughly following what I see in the photograph. As long as I get the general idea, it's not necessary for me to reproduce the exact shapes that I see. And while this wash is still wet, I'm going to touch in just a little bit of yellow for the portion of the center of this daisy that just peeks out along the edge of that shadow. Now I'll drop in some of the darker shadow shapes around the center of the flower. For the centers of the other two flowers, I'm going to use pretty much one brush stroke and a few little marks nearby to make the edges a bit varied. The dark mark in the center of this flower, I think, is an artifact of the program that I used to blur the photograph, so I'm not going to make a really dark mark there. I'm just going to suggest a little bit of a shadow shape there using kind of a gray-green. I think that looks more natural than the dark black mark that was in the middle of the photograph flower. Now with sort of a reddish brown, I'm going to put in some of the warm shadows that are within the center of this flower and along the edge of the center. And then I think I'll soften the edge here where the center of the flower goes up into the petals. Using a warmer gray on the light side, I'll begin painting the shadow shapes in these flowers, again, following more or less what I see in the photograph. I could have drawn pencil lines indicating where all these shadows fell, but since these colors are so light, it's quite likely I would see those pencil lines in the finished product. I would rather paint the shadow shapes somewhat loosely and capture the general idea than to get exactly the same shadow shapes and see pencil lines in the finished painting. Of course, in mine, you can see the dark line around the upper edge of this flower where it is next to the light area of the window. That's an unfortunate consequence of making the lines dark enough to show up on the video. If you kept your pencil lines nice and light, you won't see that in the finished product. Notice how I allowed the colors of my shadows to vary a little bit from a warmer gray to a cooler gray, sometimes with a little bit of green in it and sometimes with a bit of yellow in it. This helps create a sense of reflected light. Finally, I'll go back with a somewhat darker gray and drop in just a few darker shadows here and there, again using the photo as an aid to deciding where those might be most effective. Congratulations! If you're feeling a little bit exhausted, that's because this painting is quite a bit more sophisticated in its planning and execution than anything else that we've done in this course. We did a lot of different steps so that we could practice many different methods of preserving and reserving lights. I suggest that when you first start to plan paintings of your own, you keep your paintings quite a bit simpler and use one or two of these techniques until you have more experience. Figuring out what to paint first and what to paint next, and which methods to use to reserve whites and lights in a watercolor is one of the most challenging aspects of watercolor painting. It takes a fair amount of experience to get good with this, so don't expect yourself to figure that out immediately. Planning a painting and determining the painting sequence and strategy is one of the main topics covered in Watercolor Skill Builder. And even after that 6-week course, many people are still struggling with this aspect of a watercolor painting. Stick with it, and over time, you'll get better and better at deciding what sequence you want to use and how you want to reserve your lights. There, there are many different ways to approach any individual watercolor, and with experience, you'll begin to discover which ones work best for your method of working and for the look that you want to achieve. Happy painting!